You think Athelstan was a love story, a gentle monk taken by Vikings who slowly fell in love with their culture, a man caught between two worlds, two faiths, two identities, torn but ultimately enriched by the experience. The TV show made it beautiful. Ragnar's curiosity, Athelstan's quiet wisdom, a friendship that transcended religion and war. Millions of viewers watched it and thought, maybe the Vikings weren't so bad after all. But the real Athelstan, there was no friendship, there was no gentle curiosity, there was no spiritual awakening. There was only fire, screaming, and the complete destruction of a world that had stood for centuries. Because the real story behind Athelstan isn't about one monk. It's about what happened to an entire civilization of monks, thousands of them, when the Viking longships appeared on the horizon. And what happened wasn't a cultural exchange. It was an extinction event. Today, you'll discover 3 things the show turned into entertainment but were actually nightmares. First, what really happened at Lindisfarne in 793 AD, the raid that shocked all of Christian Europe and launched the Viking Age, told from the perspective of the monks who lived through it. Second, what actually happened to captured monks like Athelstan, not the romantic version, but the documented reality of slavery, humiliation, and forced paganism. And third, the letter written by a real historical figure named Alcuin of York that reveals the raw horror and theological crisis that these raids caused across the Christian world. A letter so disturbing that it rewrites everything the show made you believe. This isn't a love story. This is a horror story. And the monks were the victims. Picture England in the late 8th century. A green, quiet island where monasteries sat on coastal cliffs and river islands like jewels, undefended, filled with gold, silver, sacred relics, and men who had never held a weapon in their lives. These weren't fortresses. They were libraries, hospitals, schools, places where men devoted their entire existence to prayer, scholarship, and the preservation of knowledge. They had no walls, they had no armies, they had God. And on a cold morning in June 793, God wasn't enough. Because what came across the North Sea that morning wasn't a trading vessel. It wasn't a diplomatic envoy. It was a force that would shatter the foundations of Christian Britain and create a trauma so deep that monks across Europe would write about it for the next 300 years. The longships were coming, and the monks of Lindisfarne had no idea what a longship was. To understand what Athelstan represents, you need to understand what Lindisfarne was before the Vikings turned it into a graveyard. Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, sat just off the northeast coast of England, connected to the mainland by a thin strip of land that disappeared under the tide twice a day. When the water rose, the island became a fortress of isolation, a place deliberately separated from the world. That was the point, and the monks chose it because they wanted to be closer to God and further from everything else. The monastery had been founded in 634 AD by an Irish monk named Aidan. By the time the Vikings arrived, it had been a center of Christian learning for over 150 years. Generations of monks had lived, studied, and died on that island. They had produced one of the most beautiful manuscripts in human history, the Lindisfarne Gospels, a book so intricately decorated with gold leaf and impossible geometric patterns that modern scholars still can't fully explain how it was made with 8th century tools. This wasn't a poor outpost. This was one of the intellectual capitals of the Christian world. But here's the detail the TV show never mentioned. The monks of Lindisfarne had absolutely no concept of what was coming, not because they were naive, as because there was genuinely no precedent. England's coasts had been peaceful for generations. The idea that someone would cross the North Sea specifically to attack a monastery was so unthinkable that the monasteries didn't even have a word for it. There were no watchtowers, no warning systems, no escape plans. They were lambs, and they didn't know wolves existed. Now picture a young monk on that island. Not Athelstan, that's a fictional name, but someone like him. A boy given to the monastery as a child, as was common practice, raised entirely within those stone walls, taught to read Latin before he could run, taught that the world was ordered, that God protected the faithful, that devotion was a shield stronger than any metal. This boy had never seen violence, had never heard a war cry, had never seen a weapon used against a human body. His entire universe was prayer at dawn, scripture study, bread and water, silence, and the sound of waves against the island's shore. His hands were soft from holding quills. His voice was trained for hymns. His mind was filled with psalms and theology and the absolute certainty that the world made sense because God had designed it to make sense. Was that faith or blindness? In June 793, the answer arrived with the tide. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the most important historical records of medieval England, describes what happened next in the kind of terse, horrified language that tells you the writers could barely process what they were recording. Strange signs had appeared in the sky over Northumbria, they wrote. Whirlwinds and lightning and fiery dragons flying through the air. Whether these were real atmospheric phenomena or the medieval mind trying to make sense of impending catastrophe, the message was the same. Something terrible was about to happen, and the heavens themselves were screaming warnings that no one on Lindisfarne knew how to read. The monks went to bed that night in their stone cells. They said their evening prayers. They pulled their rough wool blankets over their bodies and closed their eyes in a world that still made sense. It was the last night that world would exist. Because when dawn broke on June 8th, 793 AD, the horizon was no longer empty. Dark shapes were moving across the grey water toward the island. Low, fast, cutting through the waves with a speed that no English vessel could match. Dragon heads carved into the prows, mouths open, eyes staring forward. The monks had never seen anything like them. They didn't know what they were looking at, but they were about to learn. The first sound was not a war cry. It was the grinding of wooden hulls against the rocky shore of Lindisfarne. Then boots on stone, heavy, fast, deliberate. The sound of men who had crossed an ocean, not to trade, not to talk, but to take. Dozens of them, maybe more, pouring off the longships and moving up the beach toward the monastery with the focused efficiency of predators who had identified prey from a great distance. The monks heard it from inside their cells. Some were still praying. Some were preparing the morning meal. Some were in the scriptorium, bent over manuscripts, carefully applying ink to parchment with steady hands that would never be steady again. What happened next was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Vikings struck the monastery like a storm hitting a glass house. There were no defenders, no shields, no swords. The monks had nothing but wooden crosses and the desperate belief that sacred ground would protect them. It didn't. The raiders moved through the monastery systematically, not in blind rage, but with the cold precision of men who had done this before and knew exactly what they were looking for. Gold first. The altarpieces, the chalices, the ornamental covers of sacred books, the reliquaries containing the bones of saints. Anything that gleamed was torn from its place and thrown into sacks. Silver candlesticks were bent and crushed to fit into carrying bags. Jeweled crosses that monks had spent years crafting were stripped in seconds. But the gold wasn't the worst of it. The monks themselves were currency. Alcuin of York, the most important English scholar of the age, advisor to Charlemagne himself, wrote a letter shortly after the raid that survives to this day. And in that letter, he describes what happened to the monks with a grief so raw that you can feel the ink trembling on the page. Monks were dragged from the altar. Some were killed where they stood, not because the Vikings were in a frenzy, but because killing a few made the rest compliant. The survivors watched their brothers fall, and their resistance collapsed. The living were more valuable than the dead. Healthy men could be sold in the slave markets of Hedeby, Dublin, or Constantinople for significant silver. They were bound, stripped of their robes, forced to walk barefoot across the rocky shore to the longships. Men who had never left the island in their entire adult lives were now being loaded onto foreign vessels, surrounded by men speaking a language they couldn't understand, carrying weapons they had never imagined. Can you picture that moment? You have spent your entire life in silence and prayer. Your hands know only ink and bread. Your ears know only hymns and waves. And now, you are standing in the belly of a dragon-headed ship, your wrists tied, watching your home, the only world you have ever known, burning on the horizon behind you. The Lindisfarne Gospels survived. Someone, we don't know who, had the presence of mind to hide the manuscript before the Vikings reached the scriptorium. As that book exists today in the British Library, its gold leaf and impossible geometry intact, a miracle of preservation. But the men who created it, they were gone, scattered across the slave routes of the Norse world like seeds thrown into a hurricane. And this is where the TV show's version of Athelstan begins. A monk taken by Ragnar, brought to Scandinavia, slowly integrated into Viking society. The show made it look like curiosity, like cultural exchange, like Ragnar saw something special in this monk and chose to elevate him. The reality was the opposite. Captured monks were slaves, property. They were bought and sold like livestock. Some were used as household laborers. Some were used as translators because their Latin education made them useful for navigating the Christian kingdoms the Vikings wanted to raid next. And some were used for entertainment, forced to demonstrate their strange rituals for the amusement of Norse households. And some simply disappeared, worked to death, frozen in unfamiliar climates, killed when they were no longer useful. The historical record is full of silences where captured monks should be, and those silences tell you everything. The show gave Athelstan a voice, a friendship, and a spiritual journey. The real captured monks got chains, foreign soil, and the slow erasure of everything they were. But what happened to the Christian world's response to all this? That's where the story takes its most devastating turn. The raid on Lindisfarne didn't just destroy a monastery. It detonated a theological crisis across the entire Christian world. Think about what this event meant to 8th century Christians. And these weren't secular people who could rationalize an attack as geopolitics or bad luck. These were people who believed, with absolute certainty, that God actively protected the faithful. That sacred ground was inviolable, that a life devoted to prayer earned divine shield against the darkness of the world. And then pagans sailed across the sea and burned God's house to the ground. How do you explain that? How does a monk in a distant monastery hear the news from Lindisfarne and still believe that his prayers matter, that his walls will hold, that the God he has devoted his entire life to will protect him when the dragon ships appear on his horizon? Alcuin of York tried to answer that question, and his answer broke something fundamental. Alcuin was not a minor figure. He was the most respected Christian intellectual in Europe. Born in York, educated at the cathedral school there, he had been recruited by Charlemagne himself to lead the intellectual revival of the Frankish Empire. When Alcuin spoke, the entire Christian world listened, and what Alcuin said about Lindisfarne was devastating. In his letter to the Bishop of Lindisfarne, a letter that survives in full and remains one of the most important documents of the early medieval period, Alcuin did not blame the Vikings. He blamed the monks. Read that again. He blamed the victims. Alcuin wrote that the attack was God's punishment, that the monks of Lindisfarne had grown sinful, that they had become lazy, vain, and complacent, that they had abandoned the strict discipline of their founders and allowed worldly corruption to creep into their sacred community. The Vikings, in Alcuin's theology, were not enemies. They were instruments of divine wrath, God's whip sent to punish the faithless. Was he right? Of course not. The monks of Lindisfarne were not especially sinful. They were scholars and scribes living quiet lives of devotion. But Alcuin couldn't accept the alternative, that God had simply failed to protect his servants. That possibility was more terrifying than any Viking raid because it threatened the entire logical structure of Christian civilization. So, he rewrote the narrative. The monks deserved it. God was still in control. The system still worked. The alternative, that the universe was random and prayer was meaningless, was too catastrophic to contemplate. But here's what Alcuin's letter reveals that the TV show never touched. The psychological destruction was worse than the physical destruction. And after Lindisfarne, every coastal monastery in Britain lived in terror. Monks who had spent their lives in peaceful contemplation now spent their nights listening for the sound of keels on gravel. Monasteries that had never needed walls began frantically building them. Communities that had been open and welcoming became suspicious and fearful. The entire culture of English monasticism, a culture built on trust in divine protection, was shattered in a single morning. And the raids didn't stop. They accelerated. Iona was hit in 795, Jarrow in 794. Monasteries along the Scottish coast, the Irish coast, the Frankish coast, one after another, the jewels of Christian civilization were stripped and burned. Each raid reinforced the trauma. Each burning monastery was another crack in the theological foundation. Monks began hiding their treasures, burying manuscripts in the ground, moving relics inland. Some monasteries were abandoned entirely. Communities that had existed for centuries simply packed up and fled, choosing exile over the certainty of destruction. The Lindisfarne Gospels themselves were carried from place to place for over 100 years, never safe, never settled, always one raid away from destruction. The monks who carried them lived as refugees in their own country. protecting a book that represented a world that no longer existed. And the captured monks, the real Athelstans, what happened to them in Scandinavia? The historical evidence is sparse but brutal. Some adapted. They learned Norse, adopted customs, survived by making themselves useful. Some became translators, helping Viking chieftains communicate with the English kingdoms they were planning to raid. The bitter irony, monks helping their captors destroy more monasteries. Some converted, whether by force or by the slow erosion of faith. Some captured monks abandoned Christianity and adopted Norse paganism. The TV show portrayed this as a beautiful spiritual journey. Athelstan discovering the Norse gods, feeling their pull, embracing a wider spiritual world. The reality was more likely desperation. When you are a slave in a foreign land, surrounded by people who worship different gods, and your own god has demonstrably failed to protect you or your brothers, at what point does faith become a luxury you can't afford? At what point do you stop praying to a God who didn't answer and start praying to the gods of the people who hold your chains? As that's not spiritual awakening, that's spiritual survival. And there's a difference the TV show never acknowledged. Some monks refused to convert. The historical record mentions monks who chose punishment or death over abandoning their faith. These men, whose names we will never know, held onto their crosses in a world that had taken everything else from them. They prayed in chains. They whispered Latin into the cold Scandinavian air. They died believing that God had a plan, even though every visible piece of evidence suggested otherwise. Were they heroes or fools? The answer depends entirely on what you believe about the nature of faith itself. And that question, unanswerable, uncomfortable, eternal, is the real heart of the Athelstan story. Not a friendship with a Viking king, not a romantic spiritual journey, but the fundamental human question of what happens to belief when the world proves it wrong. The TV show answered that question with beauty. The real answer was silence. The Viking raids on English monasteries continued for nearly 300 years. 300 years. An entire civilization of monks, scholars, and scribes. The people who had preserved literacy, medicine, agriculture, and history through the darkest centuries of European collapse, systematically dismantled by men who arrived in longships and left with everything that wasn't nailed down, and much that was. By the time the raids finally subsided, the monastic world that had produced Lindisfarne, Iona, Jarrow, and dozens of other centers of learning was unrecognizable. Some monasteries were rebuilt, most were not, and the communities that had once been the intellectual backbone of Western Europe were scattered, impoverished, and permanently traumatized. And the captured monks, the real Athelstans, they vanished. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but slowly, across generations, they were absorbed into the Norse world. Their Latin faded. Their prayers went quiet. Their children, if they had children, grew up speaking Norse, worshipping Norse gods, knowing nothing of the stone cells and illuminated manuscripts their fathers had left behind. The erasure was total, not by violence, in the end, but by time. And that is the cruelest part of the real Athelstan story. The TV show gave him a dramatic death, a martyrdom, a sacrifice, a moment of meaning. He died for something. His death mattered. It changed Ragnar. It changed the story. As the real captured monks got no such closure. They didn't die for meaning. They died in obscurity, in foreign soil, holding onto fragments of a faith that the world had proved powerless. No one wrote their names down. No one recorded their last words. No one built monuments over their graves. They simply stopped existing. And the world moved on as if they had never been there at all. But here's the contradiction that makes this story impossible to forget. The manuscripts survived. The Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, dozens of other illuminated texts created by monks in the centuries before the Vikings arrived. These books, carried by refugees, buried in the ground, hidden in walls, smuggled across borders, outlasted everything. The monasteries fell. The monks were taken. The faith was shaken to its foundations. But the books endured. The men who made them are nameless. The art they created is immortal. The TV show created a character named Athelstan and gave him a face, a voice, a story, and a meaningful death. It was good television. It made audiences care about a monk in a way they never would have otherwise. But the real Athelstan, the nameless monk standing on Lindisfarne that June morning in 793, watching the dragon ships emerge from the mist, holding nothing but a wooden cross and a prayer that was about to go unanswered. That man didn't get a story. He got erased. And the fact that we're still talking about him 1,000 years later, using a fictional name because history didn't bother recording his real one, tells you everything about who writes the stories and who gets forgotten. The Vikings got sagas. The monks got silence. If you want to discover more forgotten souls that history buried beneath the legends, subscribe now. The truth is always darker than the show.